Right, how y'all doing? Welcome back to the next episode of Reading with SHILO. What up, baby? I'm SHILO. I'm chill. What's the business? We up here about to get into part 2 of chapter 10 of the Medical Apartheid by Miss Harriet A. Washington this morning. Jump in that thing and roll through the sea of pages. See what Miss Harriet A. Washington is talking about. What can we learn and grow from in Miss Harriet A. Washington's book? Chapter 10, we are in cage subjects. We're talking about the prisoners, man. Doing all them experiments on the prisoners. I don't like it. But let's get going. Let's work our body, work our mind, and work our body again. Man, what can I do? Shit, man. Push-ups. I'll do that. Let's do some push-ups. Let's get in there. Yeah, get in there. 25 things, man. Do 25 things. You do your 25, I'm gonna do my 25. Come on, get off your ass, man. Get off your ass. Ma'am, sir, ma'am, let's do the damn thing. Let's get something going, man. Let's get something going. Let's get something going up in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 1 more, 25. There we go. All right, we got it. We got it in, so let's get it in. All right, we out here. What up, shalom, whoever it be who has laid their eyes upon me. The ears are open and ready to hear. So hopefully I'm loud and clear. Worked out body. Hopefully you did your 25 somethings. I did my 25 somethings. And I'm about ready to get into chapter 10. Part 2 of chapter 10, cage subjects. Engineered invisibility. Engineered invisibility. The Medical Apartheid by Ms. Harriet A. Washington, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. Part 2, Chapter 10, Engineered Invisibility. Despite the extensive history of using Black bodies as research subjects, and despite the consistently high African American population in prison, despite the popularity of research studies with the racial emphasis, and despite the penchant for using Blacks in the most dangerous or distasteful experiments, jailed African American research subjects remained largely invisible in the medical and popular literature until the 1960s. In his book, Undue Risk, Jonathan Morneau writes that African Americans were usually excluded from earlier prison studies. And ironically, prison research in the United States, including the testicular irradiation research conducted by Dr. Carl G. Heller and his colleagues during the 1960s was generally confined to white men because participating in prison research was considered a privilege. It was denied to minorities, at least until the civil rights movement succeeded in equalizing social opportunities for African Americans, including research opportunities. Shalom, shalom, shalom. Even the report of the Adversary Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, the ACHRE, discussed in Chapter 9, agreed, noting that in 1975, the National Commission carefully examined the racial composition on the research subjects at a prison with a major drug testing program. The commission found that African Americans made up only 31% of the subject population, while this racial minority comprised of 60% of the general prison population. The ACHRE's broad suggestion that Blacks were underrepresented in prison medical experimentation is fatally weakened by the fact that the commission looked at only one unnamed prison experiment at one point in time, and thus was not representative. But even the straw man the ACHRE set up demonstrates the disproportionate use of African Americans in prison research. Black Americans in 1975 constituted only about 11% of the U.S. population, so that the 31% utilized in this prisons experiment meant that African Americans were subjected to research at a rate just under 3 times higher than their presence in the nation's population. Now, the ACHRE looked at this high Black experimentation rate only in comparison to the even higher Black incarceration rate. And this is myopic because it looks only at the artificial universe of prisons rather than at the entire community of African Americans. And this is an essentially communitarian fallacy, which means that the analysis have gone or have ignored the most cohesive, effective community, the community of African Americans, and not the community of prison inmates. Moreover, although scientists' early prison research records were notoriously sloppy and frequently lost, extant records do make specific references to Black prison subjects. And also those researchers who had the dearth of Black subjects, such as Heller, complained of their frustrations in gaining a more diverse subject population, suggesting that they considered the inclusion of African American prisoners in research the norm. However, various prison studies had different racial compositions, and a few recorded experiments were designed as all white, just as some used only Blacks or mostly Blacks. And in Chapter 6 has already described how Joseph Goldberger, MD, chose to induce pellagra only in white prison inmates to dramatize that pellagra was not a Black disease, but would strike malnourished whites as well. Other medical experiments were reserved for African Americans, and these were often the most risky and painful, explains Hornblum. At the Holmesburg Prison Complex, where decisions about who participated in particular experiments were often left to inmate assistants, he explains it is possible that the racism in American culture was reflected in the inmates' decision about who participated in a given test. For example, only healthy colored male volunteers were permitted to enroll in a protocol for one 1957 Philadelphia experiment to promote the inoculation of human skin with herpes simplex and herpes zoster. Herpes simplex and herpes zoster. Which were painful, incurable viral disease infections. However, another Holmesburg experiment, which targeted young white volunteers, required only that they lower an arm into a detergent, sodium lauryl sulfate, found in many shampoos, for an hour daily over 55 consecutive days. Prison researchers have veiled the racial composition of their research population for the same reason that Marion Sims once hid the racial composition of his vesciovaginal fistula patients, concerned that scientists would appear to exploit powerless Black patients. And for example, when researchers wrote journal articles about the approximately 15,000 Maryland inmates of state juvenile institutions subjected to genetic tests for XYY syndrome, 85% of whom were Black, they focused upon the mostly white minority subset of this research program to hide this true racial composition of the experiment, as will be detailed in chapter 11. Perhaps the belief that Black prisoners were exempt from early experimentation can best be understood as emanating from such carefully maintained invisibility. Stripped of their freedom, their civil rights, and their family and their community connections, Black prison subjects were almost as legally invisible as the slaves in antebellum experiments. Their invisibility was perpetuated, in no small measure by the news media, which gave most Americans their only window into prison research. And until the 1970s, the early news coverage of prison research was almost universally laudatory. Researchers and prison administrators welcomed journalists' demonstration to celebrate the heroism of criminals who submitted themselves to medical experimentations. And New York Times profiles of incarcerated volunteers are all of white men, such as Sing Sing Liffa Lewis Boy. And in 1949, the Times sympathetically chronicled the risky and medically unsubstantiated experiment to which boys submitted in an attempt to save the life of an 8-year-old cancer-ridden girl. And boy lay on a gurney next to the dying girl while their circulatory systems were joined by rubber tubing so that his body could act as a filter for her poison blood. The girl died, but boy survived. And news articles strongly suggested that his selfless act had helped to expiate his crimes. And the press's attention generated intense human interest, culminating the boy's Christmas time pardon. Excuse me, right quick. Need to get that out. Oh, I need to spit that nasty shit out. An Illinois Stateville inmate, Nathaniel Leopold, half of the infamous Leopold and Leob Krill thrill-killing duo, had been the nefarious architect of the highly publicized crime of the century, the coolly executed 1942 kidnapping and murder of 14-year-old Bobby Franks, whom they dispassionately bludgeoned to death and discarded in a marsh in Chicago's South Side. But profiles in the New York Times and other newspaper detailed his key role in recruiting other inmates to join malaria experiments and in signing inmates up to potentially sight-saving corneal donations. In his memoirs, Life Plus 99 Years, Leopold boasted of his prison research roles, and this coverage helped to transform his thrill killer image and boosted his successful parole bid in 1958. But this hagiographic approach to inmate subjects had the curious effect of effacing the participation of Black prisoners in medical research from the period between the World Wars until the mid-1970s. News accounts do not refer to Black participation, and the images gracing these peons to social redemption are of white inmates lying on gurneys. In Life magazine's profile of Dr. Klingman's laboratories in the New York Times, photo of inmates queued up to give blood or tissue, no discernibly black bodies appear. Black volunteers may have been ignored because physicians were nearly always white males who, when approached for the name of an inmate to profile, preferred a white male for several reasons. The inmate, like Boy and Leopold, would be treated to a laudatory profile and would reap glory and other advantages, including a possible parole. So doctors cited the names of prisoners whom they thought worthy of such advantages and whose freedom they could anticipate with comfort, essentially prisoners with whom they could most easily identify. Now, mainstream journalists too were nearly universally white until the late 1960s. And they also identified with Leopold's articulateness, intellectual attainments, and socioeconomic level in a manner they could never have identified with Jesse Williams. White volunteers were also more likely, like Leopold, to have obtained good educations and thus were more likely to find an audience for their memoirs, which, not surprisingly, cast them in the most sympathetic light. Among such researchers, especially in Southern prisons, frank racism also precluded Black medical volunteers from reaping positive publicity. Volunteer medical slavery. Volunteer medical slavery. But were prisoners Black or white really volunteers? And in 1947, the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg charged Nazi doctors with war crimes, including experimentation upon prisoners of war. The Germans ably conducted defense hinged upon Dr. Gerhard Rose's contention that U.S. doctors were guilty of exactly the same abuses, regularly subjecting prisoners to dangerous, painful, involuntary experiments. The trials culminated not only in the conviction and execution of many accused physicians, but also in the Nuremberg Code, which was devised to govern future medical experimentation. The U.S. delegation to the Nuremberg trials included Andrew Ivy, MD, the American Medical Association representative. He offered an idealistic view of an American prison research, assuring the public that the highest standards were upheld. Ivy specifically claimed that American prisoners had never been abused or used involuntarily, but he was wrong. And in fact, a mere year after Nuremberg, the Journal of the American Medical Association praised the Statesville prison malaria experiments, which violated the Nuremberg prescription against experimentation by using prisoners. Unfortunately, American researchers have never thought of the code as pertinent to their own research. And Yale Law School ethicist J. Katz, MD, avers that in the eyes of many American researchers, it was a good code for barbarians, but an unnecessary code for ordinary physicians. And in the Nazi doctors and the Nuremberg Code, George Anus and Michael Grodin analyzed how U.S. investigators rejected Nuremberg and replaced it with not but hollow assurances that American medical researchers needed no such constraints. The Nuremberg Code is also toothless, carrying no penalties for its breach, and so it is widely ignored. And the vague, unsubstantiated claims proposed by Ivy stood in opposition to the judgments of all the pertinent medical organizations, which, by the end of World War II, had already weighed experimentation with prisoners in their ethical balances and found it wanting. Even the specially appointed research committee of the AMA denounced experimentation with prisoners as a human rights violation, despite the AMA's praise of the malaria experiments. And in 1952, this AMA House of Delegates accordingly issued the resolution entitled Disapproval of Participation in Scientific Experimentation by Inmates of Penal Institutions. Physicians, universities, or jails could not claim to be unaware of this position, but the AMA sent copies of the resolution to governors, state and federal prison officials, and parole boards. Similarly, the Ethical Committee of the World Medical Association, in its 1961 Code of Ethics on Human Experimentation, declared persons detained in prisons, penitentiaries, or the reformatories, being captive groups, should not be used as subjects on human experiment, nor persons in a position in which they are incapable of exercising the power of free choice. Man. But none of these prohibitions on medical experimentations with prisoners was ever enforced, so they were blithely ignored by researchers who were allowed to police themselves, and researchers, wardens, pharmaceutical companies, and universities echoed Ivy's claim that prisoners chose to participate voluntarily and even clamored for inclusion in experiments. Were prison subjects, black and white, willing volunteers who freely consented to inoculation with deadly infectious diseases and to testing that removed or damaged their skin, hair, and nails? Did they voluntarily submit to castration for a few dollars and the transplantation of animal tissues and cancer cells as an exposure to chemical warfare agents and untried psychoactive drugs? Usually no. The supposedly free consent of American prisoners was circumscribed in several ways. In the most extreme cases, some prisoners' rights to say no simply did not exist. And for example, between January 1967 and April 1968, imprisoned subjects at the California Medical Facility were paralyzed with succinyl. They were paralyzed with succinyl, SUCCINYLCHOLINE. Succinyl, also known as ancetine. A neuromuscular compound that paralyzes muscles so that the prisoners could not move or breathe. And many likened the terrifying experiences to drowning in fetters. When 5 of the 64 selected prisoners refused to participate in the experiment, the institution's Special Treatment Board gave permission on behalf of the recalcitrant men for them to be injected against their will. But prison administrations usually exerted subtler pressure in the form of authority figures and even prisoner advocates such as social workers who steered penalist inmates to research studies. Damn. Penalists. Former Holmesburg social worker Priscilla Beckroff recalls, if somebody didn't have money for the commissary and wasn't on the list for a job, the social worker would say, you can go to the U of P test operation. Another social worker admitted harboring doubts about the medical studies to which he referred inmates. We questioned it among ourselves, but nobody looked into it. And the medical personnel walked around in white coats and looked very official and authoritative. Parole boards exerted considerable pressure as well. And the well-publicized releases of volunteers such as Louis Boy, Nathan Leopold, and 59 survivors of the Statesville malaria experiment dangled a tantalizing, come on, I'm gonna start fucking with me now, a tantalizing carrot of freedom before potential subjects. And although volunteers usually did not receive parole, administrators often placed letters of thanks and commendations in volunteers' files, which might have raised their hopes. But parole boards sometimes exerted strong negative pressure as well, according to inmates such as Nick Dispodo of the Arizona State Prison, who claimed in the New York Times article that parole boards routinely held a refusal to participate in research against inmates seeking release from his institution. The prisoner's ability to consent freely was also compromised by the lack of essential information. Informed consent is mandatory for research subjects in all venues, but researchers often do not divulge the true nature of the risks and often do not even explain the actual nature of the experiments. And a New York Times expose on the multi-prison debacle of Dr. Austin Stowe mentioned earlier reveals that there was no informed consent and that no accurate records were kept. And some researchers who claimed that to have consent forms could not produce them. Jesse Williams, veteran of scores of experiments, had repeatedly insisted, "I was never given a consent form. I never saw a consent form." Consent forms made sporadic appearances in prison research, but the average Black prisoner was poorly educated and or even illiterate, so even when presented with a consent form, he was unlikely to be able to read or understand it. Former Black inmate Edward Anthony, for example, insists that he had no idea what researchers meant by terms such as toxicity or efficacy. Consent forms often were so vague, misleading, and replete with technical data and scientific language that the physicians themselves could not understand them. And although consent forms made only sporadic appearances, legal releases were de rigueur. I think it's supposed to be rigorous, or in French, rigorous. The French word for rigorous, de rigueur. And lots of men were burned and scarred and wanted to sue. But they had signed releases and waivers and thought that they couldn't. Recalls white former Philadelphia inmate Al Zabala. Investigators went to remarkable lengths to deceive inmates about the harms inherent in the tests. And Jesse Williams spoke of participating in what had been described to him as a footwear experiment, in which he had to wear boots taped to his feet nonstop for a week. And this actually was an experimental attempt to induce a hard to eradicate foot fungus. When white inmate James Boyce worked as a laboratory assistant, doctors suggested that to allay inmates' fear about the test safety, Boyce affixed cotton balls to the dummy patches to his own back and arms in order to heighten the deception. And the researchers even paid Boyce as if he were a participant. Prisoners at Holzberg were often reassured that the shampoos and the lotions that were tested on them were perfectly safe and could cause only minor irritation. And 30 to 50 years later, the men remain bald, scarred, or suffer skin and internal organ damage. But what of other volunteers? Those who were neither physically forced nor strongly guided to the prison administration. When they participated, did they offer themselves up voluntarily? The answer here hinges upon the meaning of voluntarily. Copious evidence exists that coercion was a key element of the supposed consent given by most African American prisoners. Today's clinical medical ethicists tend to define coercion in medical research very narrowly and without much precision. And so many would argue that the inmate may have been induced by, but were not coerced. However, such critics fail to take into account the coercive features of the prison's special environment. The hell of prison life made the research laboratory feared and abhorred by African Americans on the outside, or an irresistible haven, even a life support unit for the African American prisoner. Man. Except for a few memoirs by famous inmates such as Leopold, the description of inmates' motives for volunteering emanated from researchers and prisoner administrators. They agreed that the inmates were motivated by money, with which they could purchase items such as cigarettes, purchase items such as cigarettes, radios, and the meager delicacies of the commissary. And researchers also sometimes noted for the press that prisoners enjoyed the special amenities of the prison ward, such as more frequent showers, better meals, and calmer, more secure surroundings. And the news media unquestioningly echoed these supposed motivations, subtly sabotaging images of inmate heroism. But researchers and prison administrators had hardly disinterested observers, and they did not tell everything they knew about prisoners' true motives. Being admitted to the research unit allowed the inmates to avoid the legion of institutional predators. A stint in the lab offered a respite from the ever-present threat of gang rape, shakedowns, racial strife from prison gangs, and deadly assaults for 1,000 petty slights. Taking meals in the laboratory unit allowed the subjects to escape the mess hall and dreaded sight of frequent melees and stabbings. The inmates did speak with relish of the better meals and calmer, I guess it's supposed to be calmer, and calmer atmosphere of the research laboratory, and freely acknowledged their need for money. There is no question that men participated for the $300 to $400 a month, or up to $1,500 per experiment they could earn, because the few dollars a week the underskilled could earn in a prison laundry or kitchen offered no competition. But a cultural dissonance, there we go. But a cultural dissonance separated the hostile, violent chaos of the inmates' world and the benign, orderly environment of the universal researcher or journalist. Money had a very different meaning for inmates than it had for outsiders. Inmates sought not only commissary baubles and delicacies to brighten life, but more important, the price of freedom, or at least of safety. Poverty, not criminal behavior, is the most common feature of the imprisoned. And jails are full of people, both guilty and innocent, who are there only because they are too poor to make bail. And by the 1970s, most prisoners in Holmesburg, for example, were legally innocent men awaiting trial. And between the 1940s and 1970s, bail bondsmen typically would spring an inmate for a down payment of 10% of his bail, so that a man jailed in lieu of the $500 bond could buy his freedom within weeks, with the $50 he earned for a single medical experiment. Ooh, that's how they get you. Ooh, that's how they get them. You want to get out? Do this experiment. Several inmates also mentioned in motivation about which the news media kept silent. The human landscape of prison is largely devoid of affection, and incarcerated men describe time in a research laboratory as a respite from the psyche, a place where one could go for a while to be addressed and touched with kindness, dignity, and concern. Researchers such as Klingman knew this, and he imparted the knowledge to medical proteges during lectures. Many of the prisoners, for the first time in their lives, find themselves in the role of important human beings. We say to them, "You're important. We need you." Once this is established, these guys will knock their brains out to please you. If the experiment does not pan out, they get depressed. They become emotionally involved with the projects. The capacity to respond to love is greater than most people realize. And I feel almost like a scoundrel, like Machiavelli, because of what I can do to them. Solomon McBride, Dr. Klingman's chief scientific assistant, was African American. And although he had no formal education in pharmacology, Acres of Skin describes how he managed the Holmesburg testing program on a daily basis for 20 years, once again illustrating how some blacks participating in experimental injuries to black subjects. However, McBride described the studies as non-invasive procedures and claimed nobody was injured in those tests. When confronted about the lifelong injuries to inmates, he denied knowledge of such practices. "I wasn't aware of that," said McBride. "I don't think it ever happened." And when asked about the use of radioactive isotopes, he is quick to respond, "No, that wasn't done. I don't think the prison would permit it." And informed that documents about the Atomic Energy Commission verify the use of isotopes at Holmesburg, he admits, "I heard about it, but I don't know anything about it. I was opposed to things that were not kosher, and if I saw something wrong, I'd tell them to stop. I told the residents not to do stuff that was dangerous, and if they hurt those black brothers, I wouldn't let them do that." Not sounding too good, Mr. McBride. Despite McBride's denial, Holmesburg prisoners suffered psychiatric damage and physical injuries that crippled them for life. Many inmates believe that research physicians had sown the seed of deadly cancers during their time in the laboratory. But this claim cannot be proven because inmates do not know to what they were exposed. Inmates also volunteered to experiments because the laboratory was often the inmate's sole point of entry to medical care, which was sketchy. On evenings and weekends, medical staff were often simply unavailable, and guards or even trusted inmates performed triage on a sick call model, assessing who was ill, who was malingering, and who was sick enough to justify the inconvenience of arranging transport to the distant medical care. Continuous medical care, such as the quality cancer chemotherapy and regular diabetes maintenance, apart from blood glucose drugs, were simply unavailable. Let me see. How many more pages do we have? How many more pages? No, we're not far. I'm going to go ahead and try to push it. We're going to finish this. We're going to finish chapter 10 today. Prison purge research. Prisons purge research. By the 1970s, researchers in prisons began to disappear, succumbing to scandals that unmasked the racially unbalanced, abusive, dangerous, and scientifically sloppy nature of experimentation with prisoners. The exploitation of large numbers of black male prisoners caused public relations problems for researchers and institutions in the wake of the increasingly violent and bitter civil rights battles and the revelations of the syphilis study at Tuskegee. The thalidomide scandal, in which thousands of deformed children were born to European women who took the poorly tested drug, was another important catalyst in tainting the American perception of medical research. And furthermore, Harvard researcher Henry K. Beecher, MD, had published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that criticized 22 cases of exploitative experimentation. An early version of the article had detailed 50 abusive cases, and the journal was able to induce Dr. Beecher not to identify the physicians, but the pharmaceutical industry feared that next time the researcher of Beecher's stature might name names. And the very next year, British physician Maurice Papworth did so. The formerly fawning news media delivered the coup de grace by thrusting researcher after researcher into the harsh light of public exposure. And on July 29, 1965, the New York Times published a page-one article that exposed Dr. Austin Stowe's ethically and scientifically sloppy drug testing program, which had crippled and killed unknown numbers of men throughout the state prisons of Alabama. Unlike the early articles, which had praised the experiments, this account suggested that most of his victims were Black. And in the early 1970s, the Washington Star exposed the use of approximately 15,000 Black boys in Maryland juvenile institutions in XYY experiments. And these are further described in Chapter 11. The malaria experiments that had been lauded as daring for a few decades earlier, were roundly condemned in the mid-70s as deadly. And some of the bitterest prison battles were physical as well as verbal, causing the almost universally white investigators to fear for their safety. Dr. Sigmund Wiseman described being slammed against the wall by 6'4", 250-pound Roy Tiger Williams, a Black inmate at Holmesburg who had lost his hair after testing a shampoo formulation. "I was scared to death. He threatened to kill me," and physicians grew frightened of working with the increasingly distrustful inmates and felt intimidated by the growing influence of the Black Muslims who cast a jaundiced eye on prison experimentation. Bert Kahn, MD, who worked at Holmesburg Prison from 1959 to 1965, saw he left in part because he feared for his personal safety. "I became concerned about the growth in the Muslim movement. The deaths of 29 inmates and 11 white authority figures in the 1971 African prison riot also sent a chill through prison medical research programs. Such programs suffered legal repercussions as well, and Attica inmates won damages for suffering ill treatment and assaults." In 1979, 9 Oregon prison subjects shared $2,215 in damages when a lawsuit by one medical experimentation victim at Holmesburg Prison resulted in a monetary settlement whose terms are confidential. And other pharmaceutical company researchers realized that they too could become targets of successful inmate legal action. Charles Miller, A prison research administrator for pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly lamented, "The reason we closed the doggone thing down was we were getting too much hassle and heat from the press. It just didn't seem worth it." And in January of 1973, Atlanta Monthly cover story by investigative journalist Jessica Mitford proved even more powerful. She explained that prison medical research consisted of exploitation of the lowest, most vulnerable classes by members of the most privileged. This article became a chapter entitled Cheaper Than Chimpanzees in her 1973 book, Kind and Usual Punishment, a dissection of the U.S. prison system. Soon afterward, Senator Edward Kennedy held hearings that led the National Commission for the Protection of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, the CPBBR, which investigated medical experimentation on prisoners. It considered banning such research outright, as most other Western industrialized countries had done decades earlier. And despite headlines such as "Government to Ban Medical Research on Federal Inmates," it decided against this in 1976, partly because not only pharmaceutical companies, but also many prisoners opposed the ban. Inmates wish to have the opportunity to participate for several reasons. They can make real money no other way. They sometimes could obtain health care no other way. They missed the safety and amenities of the research laboratory, and they wanted to feel they were contributing to society. In 1979, the state prison of Southern Michigan inmates even filed suit to prevent the FDA from excluding them from research studies. And instead of banning prison research outright, the CPBBR proposed a detailed accreditation scheme that Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare Joseph Califano, in consultation with the American Correctional Association, rejected as impractical. In 1978, HEW produced stringent human experimentation regulations, which remain in effect today. And so did CPBBR's 1979 report, known as the Belmont Report, which placed the onus on researchers for ensuring that research with prisoners provided informed consent and is therapeutic under what is called the common law. The common law sets strict limits on non-therapeutic research and research done with prisoners, and requires the review of proposed studies by institutional research review boards. Institutional review boards. No study in a prison can present more than a minimal risk to the inmate. In sum, there remain 4 types of permissible prison research: that in the cause and effect of incarceration and crime, the study of prisons or of incarcerated persons, investigations of conditions that affect prisoners en masse, and therapeutic studies. Although these reforms were necessary and laudable, they are imperfect, and especially because the language is vague. And what, for example, constitutes minimal risk? Even the definition of therapeutic research has come into questions. And still, research at most prisons, including Holmberg's, ceased by 1976 as a result of public outrage and lawsuits. Research Renaissance. Research Renaissance. Most people don't realize that prison medical research, which all but died out in the 1970s, is enjoying a quiet renaissance. Since the late 1980s, investigators in Arkansas, Maryland, South Carolina, Texas, Florida, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have been conducting and proposing research in prisons. Even more crucial to understand than the past exploitation of African Americans in prisons is the future medical use and possible abuse of African Americans, because they are the single fastest growing group in prison population today. In prison population. Today, research with prisoners means research with Blacks, because in 2004, African Americans constituted 44 to 46% of all prisoners, which is almost 4 times their proportion in the general population. Clearly, prison experimental abuse is likely to affect African Americans disproportionately, and thanks in large part to mandatory sentencing for drug infractions. Women are not spared, and Black women make up the fastest growing population in American prisons. The HIV pandemic and the more recently recognized hepatitis C epidemic have attracted federal dollars and the support of pharmaceutical companies. This has renewed the interest in prisoners as subjects, because 17% of the incarcerated have HIV, 6 times the rate on the outside. But because most HIV positive people in the United States and in U.S. prisons are Black, the question of HIV research in prisons is a question of Blacks being used in such research. I don't know. I kind of feel funny about that. Oh, wait. Let me stretch it out. Stretch it out. For hepatitis C virus, HSV, the statistics are even more dire. Inmates have the highest HCV infection rate in the country. 2% of all Americans, about 20% of inmates, are HCV infected. For imprisoned Black men, the HCV infection rate is much higher, as high as 60%. But prison research today is not restricted to these ailments, because inmates suffering from disorders ranging from asthma to cancer have attracted the attention of U.S. researchers, who are conducting 10,000 biomedical research programs. Most of these researchers are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS, which, for example, supports the Yale School of Medicine with $178.7 million, and the University of Miami Medical Center with $191 million. In 1999, Brown University researchers even mounted a lawsuit to gain access to prisons for HIV research. They cited the high rates of HIV and other infectious diseases in prisons and the need of inmates for cutting-edge treatments, casting their desire to do research as a plea for therapy. And they are correct in pointing out that too little attention has been paid to prisoners' health. As early as 1962, prisoners complained of the dearth of medical care and therapeutic research aimed at prisoners' ills. But why, if securing badly needed AIDS, TB, or hepatitis C therapy is the goal, do proposed prison medical programs focus on the theoretical benefits of research rather than on the known demonstration benefits of the best available therapy? Few jailed men received a standard of care for AIDS and HCV, such as protease inhibitors, HART therapy, therapy, or interferon for hepatitis C. Prisons have even failed to take simple public health measures to reduce the high incidence of anal rape and public blowing contamination, and to restore infectious disease control to prisons, which would also seem to be the cornerstone of any HIV or HCV or TB eradication policy. Let me try with this again. Brown University researchers have conflated HIV treatment and experimentation, leading one to question whether the real concern is for prisoners' health or whether researchers wish to resume the lucrative jailhouse research of yesterday. The pharmaceutical industry requires research with humans, and the nation's 45,000 researchers are hungrily eyeing the 2 million Americans behind bars. And today, arguments over the ethical codes have been replaced with utilitarian rationales focusing upon the medical benefits to society and invoking the vague right of prisoners to experimentation. But in prison research, which will take place disproportionately with African Americans, rarely really likely to focus upon therapy and to benefit prisoners, or will experimental treatments again expose prisoners to dangerous illegal medical risks, despite the federal regulations? And perhaps the best indication of researchers' actual intentions is the glance at some current protocols for research initiatives in American prisons. And researchers are currently conducting studies that involve inducing labor in pregnant inmates, testing different methods of obtaining biopsies, and conducting a clinical trial of an experimental HIV vaccine, and testing delivery of a potent new cancer chemotherapy agent directly into the liver, and artificially inducing hypothermia to treat lung cancer. A St. Petersburg Times report, I don't like it that hand, offered direct evidence that some of the therapeutic HIV approaches with HIV positive inmates may not be centered on the inmate's need for therapy, because participating inmates complained that they felt coerced to participate in such studies and agreed to do so only in order to escape poor medical care, abusive conditions, and lack of access to up-to-date HIV drugs at other Florida prisons. One particularly troubling study among those mentioned above is Dr. Joseph Zwischenberger, Dr. Joseph Zwischenberger's radical new approach to lung cancer, which is to heat the subject's blood to the temperature where the errant cancer cells theoretically will not thrive. To test his theory, he sedates inmates and connects them to the machine called the biologic HT system, which removes blood via venous and cervical tubes. And the blood is heated, then returned to the inmate's body, which is kept at a very dangerous elevated temperature of 108.5 degrees. Damn, man, that boy got fever. 108, man. Woo-wee. That boy got fever. Any adult taken to the hospital with a temperature of 105 degrees would be considered an emergency case, and cooling strategies would immediately be undertaken. But in Zwischenberg's protocol, inmates 108.5 temperatures are sustained for 2 hours, and subjects sign a consent form that lists death, seizures, congestive heart failure, burns, heart attack, and limb loss as possible complications. Ooh, man, don't take that. That's too much stuff right there. Hell no. Back out. Back out. Get in my mouth. Even if the subjects are in a late stage of lung cancer, where the cure rates are infinitesimal, this doesn't excuse such a risky procedure. Although putatively therapeutic, this research surely poses greater than minimal risks, and the consent form includes a waiver that states in part, I understand that I cannot receive financial remuneration for any injuries resulting from my participation in this project. However, the law specifically prohibits language in an informed consent document that appears to waive the subject's rights or to reveal an investigator from liability for negligence or assault. In July 2000, the Office of Human Research Protections, the OHRP, suspended 300 studies by the research of Texas Medical Branch, the UTMB in Galveston, including Zwischenberg's, after the researchers flouted federal regulations. 195 of these studies, mostly HIV and AIDS trials, were conducted in Texas prisons. And according to the Austin American-Statesman, in a September 14th, 2000 letter, the OHRP listed numerous UTMB research projects conducted outside the permissible categories for prison research and cited scant evidence that Galveston Institutional Review Board had adhered to federal law. OHRP had approved more than 400 federally funded studies in prisoners since 2000. But when it froze the UTMB's research projects, a chill once again crept over prison research. However, now that the inmate population has leaped from 200,000 in the 1970s to 2 million, researchers once again seek entrance to prisons, wishing to undertake a wide range of medical studies. The Institute of Medicine, which provides the federal government guidance on biomedical issues, has appointed the Committee on Ethical Consideration for Protection of Prisoners involved in research to study the issue. It is headed by the brilliant public health law scholar Lawrence O. Jostin, J.D., professor and director of the Center for Law and the Public Health at Johns Hopkins and Georgetown Universities. The committee will determine whether it is possible to ensure true informed consent in prisons and whether research on prisoners should be confined to the therapeutic realm. As this book went to press in late 2006, Gostin's group was still weighing the relaxation of the regulations that had muted medical research in prisons in prisons since the 1970s, and decisions may result in dramatic modifications of prison research policy as early as 2007. Man, yeah. If the doors are flung wide to investigators, will they admit in therapy or exploitation? How can we best protect sick prisoners, many of whom are Black, from abusive research without completely banning prison research? As early as 1999, Ann S. DeGroot, MD, suggested that the best way to give prisoners the aides access to cutting-edge clinical studies while protecting them from abuse is to ensure that the research is done only in prisons that already provide high-quality medical care. This way, prisoners can participate in research without feeling forced into trials. However, this chapter has demonstrated that the laws enacted to protect prisoners' rights and health consistently have failed to do so. There are no guarantees that today's promises of humane therapeutic research, which often conflates research and care, will protect inmates more effectively. And until American medicine achieves a better record of providing care while avoiding abuse, an utter ban on prison research may be the only protection. However, prisoners are not the only group of African Americans who live with the threat of being involuntarily subjected to research in the name of therapy. The next chapter chronicles the plight of Black children who are forced to serve as the experimental subjects. Man, and that was chapter 10. That was chapter 10, the cage subjects in the medical apartheid by Miss Harriet A. Washington. Ooh, man, my eyes is getting blurry. My eyes is getting very blurry. But, hey, man, we pushed through, and we finished. I thought I was going to have to do a part 3, but we didn't have to do no part 3, man. We pushed through. We rode all our way through the sea of pages that Miss Harriet Washington has laid down for us in chapter 10, and now we are moving on to chapter 11. The Children's Crusade. Research targets young African Americans. Man. Yeah, after we finish chapter 11, it's about that much right there. Definitely 2, maybe 3. 2, maybe 3 parts. 2, maybe 3 lives. Excuse me. 2, maybe 3 lives. Oh, man. Still on me. 2, maybe 3 lives to finish off chapter 11, and then we'll get to part 3. We'll get to part 3, race, technology, and medicine, and move forward. We'll keep moving forward. We'll keep moving forward. We're moving along nicely. I know I started good. I started reading well, and I kind of stumbled off because I was dozing off, man. My eyes was getting blurry, and that monster was sleep. That boy was on me. That boy was on me, man. So we worked our body, we worked our mind, and now we're gonna work our body one more again. I should do some push-ups, but I'm not. I'm gonna go ahead. What up? 25. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, yes sir, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, baby. I did my 25 things, baby. I'm on you.
That remove it or
You got to wait, son. Wait. Hope you did your 25 things. That made me a total of 50 things, man. We finished chapter
50.
Get out the way. We finished chapter 10. Like I said, we finished chapter 10. All praises for that, man. Like, comment, subscribe, man. Tell your people, man. We reading over here. We reading over here. Trying to make sure we have everything that we need to succeed. That's right. Everything we need to succeed. And we use them. We have to use them to the best of our ability.
And one is see that.
But yeah, we're gonna keep pushing. We're gonna keep pushing, one book at a time, one episode at a time, one session at a time, man. Here a little, there a little, one page at a time, one paragraph at a time, until we can find something we can learn and grow from. Find something we can learn and grow from in each one of these books. Each one of these books. So keep pushing through the day, man. I hope that y'all have a wonderful day, a wonderful one. Shalom to everybody, man. I'm out here. And we out. SHILO out to the next episode of Reading with me. SHILO. I'm out here, baby. Shalom.
That sounds like a ring.